Hi, welcome to the Quakes Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to look at some of the techniques I apply to the master bus on the standalone MPC. Now bear in mind, this is just one of the ways of doing things. It's not definitive, and don't let anybody tell you there's a right or wrong way to do this. Let's jump in. So I've been mixing since the mid-80s and I've been a mastering engineer since 1997, and this is an amalgamation of years of sitting behind a mixing desk or in a mastering studio, and now I'm hopefully translating these techniques to the MPC. You can definitely get radio ready mixes out of the MPC, and hopefully today I'll give you some kind of guidance on, helping you get there or helping you get close. Now, I was always taught to mix top down, which basically means that very early on in the mix you do the processing on the master bus, and this helps you get a rough mix much quicker, helps you get a sound to the mix, and it does actually reduce the amount of processing that you need to do on individual channels and individual buses later on. Now I'm only going to cover the master bus today, but I will describe very briefly what I've done on the individual channels and the buses, because I think this will go some way to explaining why I made the decisions I did on the actual master bus. Also, don't forget, if you do like what you see in the video, you can download the template for the master bus. There'll be details in the description below for that, so just please feel free to download it. I'll describe what you have to do to be able to load it into your MPC. So this is a quick track that I did this morning. Very basic, it's just drums, a sample, and then some horns over the top. Let's just have a quick listen. So just a quick track, banged up this morning. If you like the drums, by the way, they're available on the Quakes Motel Beats Volume 1, which is available on Bandcamp. That will also be in the description below. So let me describe my thought process for the master bus. So we go on to main outputs. If you go into track mix, go into the main outputs, you can see here. Now, when I work on the master bus, it's more about a general sound, a general overall sound for the mix. You're not really doing any surgical moves at all. It's very broad stroke. So you want to do a little bit of compression just to kind of get a little bit of glue in the mix. And you want to do some broad stroke EQ to kind of get this, an overall sound of the mix when everything's balanced. And then just maybe a tiny bit of saturation or a bit of character. I mean, I say saturation, any plugin that's going to give you some kind of character, I tend to use saturation because that's sort of the easiest and quickest way to get a ballpark kind of character to your mix. And then I put a limiter on at the end. Now the limiter is not something that I would leave on when I bounce the track, because that's not a very good idea. You want to give your mastering engineer a little bit of room to work with. I say that from personal experience because I quite often get sent mixes that are smashed to death with limiters. So I personally prefer as a mastering engineer to have a little bit of headroom to work with. So use the limiter just to catch some peaks, and it will also give you a kind of idea of how your track's going to sound once it's been mastered. So there's nothing wrong with putting a limiter on your track, but just remember, as a rule, it's better to bounce your track without the limiter on. So don't forget, if you are hitting some peaks and your limiter is doing a little bit of work in the mix, when you bounce the track, just drop it by, say, 6 dB. Then when you bounce it, you're going to eliminate any chances of there being any peaks or any overs in any way. 6 dB is a rough number. It's not definitive. So you need to check yourself. You need to make sure that it's not clipping when you bounce it and send it to the mastering engineer, or if you're going to send it to a mastering engineer. So obviously at the moment, the track doesn't have anything on it at all. Well, it doesn't have anything on the master bus. So as I said, we just played the track earlier. So there's nothing on the master bus at the moment. So let's go into my process for that. So initially, I would use a bit of compression. This is just really to kind of get a little bit of glue. So what I tend to use is the air compressor. You can see from the settings here, I start off with no threshold, obviously. It's a very low ratio and 100% mix, although I can dial that in. I tag around about 30 milliseconds because I want to let the transients get through the mix. I don't really want to be imprinting any sound on the mix at all. I literally want to, as transparently as possible, get some kind of glue in the mix. Just bring the instruments together, because obviously at the moment I've got a drum beat, a sample, and then some horns on top. And it can sound a little bit disjointed if you're taking samples from different places. And you want to kind of just create a little bit of glue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the threshold down gradually until I'm getting about 1 decibel gain reduction. You really don't want any more than that, just a little bit of a tickle. If you watch the gain reduction here, and then I'll just compensate with the output. So it literally is quite transparent. Like I said, you just want glue. You don't really want to be smashing it with a compressor. So listen very carefully when I bring it in and out of bypass. It's very subtle, but you can hear it kind of gel together with this compressor, because what it's really doing is just reducing the dynamic range, kind of squashing things together a little bit, but very, very subtly. But it just makes everything just sound a bit more gelled and a bit more like you kind of wrapped your arms around it and just controlled everything a little bit more. And that's what, a lot of the time, that's what mixing is about. It's getting control of all the sound that you've got right across the stereo field, across all the frequency ranges, just getting some control of it. So as you can see, it's a couple of decibels of gain reduction. I'll get that in place, then I'll move on to the next part. So I'll just drop it in and out of bypass and listen just for the very slight subtle changes. As I always say in my videos, bear in mind the MPC doesn't have compensation, auto gain or anything like that, so I have to try and match it by ear. I think 0.9 is sounds around about right to me. I think it was a little bit loud to start with, so it fools you just a little bit. So the next thing I'll move on to, if it needs it. Bear in mind, this is not, don't apply this to every single mix that you do. You need to assess the mix. You need to sit down, have a listen to it. Does it need to be glued? Does it need some general EQ? Does it need some color, some saturation? And then, the limiter, like I said, just plop on at the end just to catch any peaks. So don't immediately think that I have to put compression, I have to put EQ, etc., etc. You do need to assess, but this is a general guideline. Out of all of the mixes that I do for myself and for clients, this is kind of a starting point for me. I'll listen to, does it need gluing? Does it need EQ? Does it need character? And not necessarily in that order either. You can do it in a different order. So I'm going to go into the EQ next. I use Air Power EQ on the MPC because it's pretty transparent. So let's have a look what I've done here. Well, actually I haven't done anything yet, so I'll show you. So what I really want to do is I just want to get a little bit of low end. So I'm going to use a shelf around about 80 hertz. We'll have a listen in a second. It sounds a little bit muddy and a bit congested in the low mids to me, so I'll probably adjust that, give it a little bit of clarity. And it doesn't really sound like it needs too much high end, but I'll have a listen to what the high end's doing just by maybe a shelf 7K, 8K kind of area. So let's have a listen. I'm going to EQ it live. So again, very, very subtle. I wondered why the low end had dropped out right at the start. It's because that was on -12 for some reason, not really quite sure why. So I've had to give it quite a bit of beef in the low end. I found that 80 was a little bit too low, so I've just brought it up a little bit, up to 86.5. Needed a little bit of brightening up. But remember, this is a broadband EQ. You're not doing surgical work here. So, keep the Q level quite broad and really, really listen to the overall sound. And you have to listen, it's quite overwhelming sometimes. Listen to the low end, listen to the low mids, listen to the mids, listen to the high mids, listen to the highs, listen to it in that order. I've always done it in that order, starting off with the low end, because I find that if you get the low end right and then go into the mids, get the mids right, everything else falls into place, especially with the mids. The mids are really, really important, but you need to get the lows in place and under control really before you start looking at the mids. In my opinion, there's no right or wrong way. It's just how I've always done it in that order, working through the frequency range. What's really handy about this AirPower EQ as well is you can make the adjustments to the highs, lows, etc. Switch it in and out, see what kind of effect you had. So I'm going to drop it in and out, listen to it. It's very, very subtle, but yeah, it's got a bit of beef in the low end. Scooped out a little bit of that mud, kind of around about 200. I might take that up to 220 actually. We'll have a listen in a second. And yeah, just listen to just the differences. Very, very subtle, but again, like I said, broad stroke. Okay, so at this point I'm going to engage the limiter just really to get a bit more volume out of it and just to catch the peaks. This is before I'm going to start adding any kind of saturation, and I want to add some character to it, so I am going to use a bit of saturation in this case. So I'm going to bring the limiter on. I've got air limiter. Now again, remember, I'm really not going to be doing very much with this. It's literally just catching the peaks. We want to bring the ceiling down to about 0.2. Have the look ahead. I find 0.5 seems to work quite nicely with this limiter. Let's take this up to about 80, just to mono the low ends, any subs that's going on. Again, this isn't something that we'll do on every single track, but there's quite a lot of low end going on that to me just sounds like it needs to be brought under control a little bit. So I'm going to mono the track from about 80 Hertz. And the release time I've got quite fast. I wouldn't really want, with this particular limiter, I don't like going any faster than about 75 milliseconds. It can distort quite easily. So you have to be quite careful with this limiter. But let's have a quick listen and we can just push a little bit of gain into the limiter. So again, really, really subtle. You can virtually not hear it at all, but I'm just catching the peaks and I'm just reducing the dynamic range again. Like I said, when I bounce this track, I would drop it, I would turn the limiter off and I would drop the overall volume by about 6 decibels, 5 decibels, 4 decibels, just to give a bit of headroom for any mastering, because you don't want to crush it. Unless of course that's the kind of sound you want to go for and you want it absolutely crushed before you bounce it, then that's absolutely fine. And if it's not going to a mastering engineer, then do that as well. Crush it as much as you like. But always remember, just bring the ceiling down a little bit. This just helps any kind of peaks that you might be getting when you. I don't want to go into too much detail, but when you convert a WAV to an MP3, you can, even if it's got a limiter on it, you can get some peaks. I don't want to go into too much detail. It's really difficult not to, but just give yourself a little bit of room, even with the limiter. So don't have that on 0. Just pull it back a little bit. Even 0.5. Just to give yourself a bit of room with the peaks. Okay, so now I've got that in place, I do want to introduce a little bit of saturation, a little bit of character. I use the air tube drive in this case. The reason why I do is it's very, very subtle, and it's got a nice sound to it. I like the sound to it. Simple. There's no other reason. There's plenty of other plugins that you can use to get a bit of character. You can even add another compressor. The vintage compressor is nice for adding a bit of character. You don't even need to compress, it just adds a kind of nice sound. If you've got Airflavor Pro, maybe some of the reason why I don't like using Airflavor Pro on the master bus is because it really does colour the sound. So unless you're going for a really, really coloured sound, with AirTube Drive, it's quite transparent but still gets that sound that I want. And like I said, you have to remember on the master bus, it's about being subtle. It's about broad stroke. It's about broad stroke. That's probably a better way to describe it. So I'm going to add a little bit of drive, a little bit of saturation. Even at those low levels, by the way, as you can see, because I've had a bit of drive to it and stuff, I've had to bring the output down a little bit just to compensate so it doesn't fool you. But you can hear that it has a bit more crispness to it, and you know, it's probably affecting the maybe third order harmonics. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a bit of crispiness to it. It's not necessarily highs or high mids, but it adds a nice little bit of clarity, a bit of crispness to it. It just kind of gives it a little bit of a tape sound. Maybe not so much a tape sound, but it just makes it sound bigger, you know, and that's the kind of sound I want to go for on this particular track. So as you can see, really, really subtle, but just listen to the difference when I bring it in and out. Focus on the kind of cowbell sound and the hi-hats and the snares. That's where it's affecting it the most. They suddenly become there's more clarity to them and more crispiness. Just take it out first and I'll drop it in. Let your ears get used to it, how it sounds without, and then I'll drop it in. So you can hear that actually brings the snare drums out in the mix a little bit. And that's why for me, doing master bus processing before I really get deep into the mix can really affect things, because you know, this is sounding nice to me at the moment, and I have done a little bit of individual work on the channels, which I'll show you in a second. But it just, by doing this little bit of work on the master bus, you know, you've got 4 plugins. The limiter's not really doing anything at all, like I said, but these other 3 plugins, you know, between the compression, the EQ and the saturation, you're forming a real nice general sound to the mix, which is the point behind it. So we'll move on. We'll go into the individual channels just so I can give you an idea of what I've done. We'll just listen to the beats. It's very subtle again what I've done here. I wanted to add a bit of lo-fi to it, so I've basically set it up so that it's a bit crunchy. Also what I've done is a tiny bit of compression on there. Bit of a higher ratio, a little bit more gain reduction than the master, but as you can see, it's still very, very subtle. Just a tiny little bit of EQ just to tidy things up. And then I've put the MPC 60 on the end, because I really feel, to be honest with you, I don't want to get into this too much. I had an MPC 60 for many years, and this to me doesn't actually really sound like an MPC 60. But I'm only doing that for memory, because I don't have a 60 next to me to compare it. But what it does do is it gives a really nice sort of girthy low end to channels that you put this on. So I don't care whether it sounds like an MPC 60. What I care about is how it sounds, and I like the sound of it. So I do use the MPC 60 quite a lot as the last insert. So coming out the drums, if we go into the main sample, let's come out of this, go into the main sample. Again, similar setup. I've crunched it right up with the Air Lo-Fi. Tiny bit of compression. It's just a little bit heavier there, higher ratio again, but I just wanted to glue it a little bit because the original sample has got quite a high dynamic range because it's a jazz track. And so I just wanted to kind of just reduce the dynamic range a bit. So I've done that with the compression, a little bit of EQ again, just to tidy things up and compensate a little bit for the aliasing that's going on with the lo-fi. In here, you can see I've crunched it up quite a lot. So I have rolled off, as you can see, a little bit of a shelf because I want it to have that aliasing kind of 12-bit sound, but I don't want it to be too much because it really gets busy in the highs. So I've just compensated a little bit for that, just rolled off a tiny little bit. Again, MPC 60 at the end. And then with the horns, let's just take that out of solo, horns. Again, very, very similar setup. I've taken all the low end out of that just so it sits over the mix. A little bit of a classic thing to do. Rather than the MPC 60, I've added a little bit of delay. You can hear that in the mix. I've also, let's go to the returns. On the returns, on return 1, I have a reverb. Sorry, I have a delay on number 2. I have an auto pan. Now, I've added a little bit of reverb onto the horns, just a tiny amount, and I've added some auto pan. Now, the reason I do this is because with a lot of sample stuff that I work on, because you're taking samples from different tracks, and in the 60s and 70s, they like to experiment with stereo quite a lot. Sometimes you'll get all the drums over there, all the horns over there, for example, which is great. You know, it was a new thing, stereo. So what I tend to do, and there are a lot of other producers that do this, especially in hip hop, is, and it wasn't always a conscious decision. With the 60 and the SP1200 and even the 3000, we often sampled in mono because we wanted to reduce the amount of sample time, the amount of memory that was taken up. But that's carried through for me. It's also a good thing to do creatively. Obviously, you don't have to worry about sample time anymore with the new gen MPCs, but I tend to put my sample drums, I put them into mono almost every single time. With samples, a lot of the time I'll put those into mono, and then with things like horns and stuff, extra leads and stuff, I might leave them. It entirely depends on the sample. There's no there's no default. Don't ever do anything by default. You have to assess every sample. With the drums on this particular track, they were all over the place. So I made them mono, I bounced it to a mono file straight away. With the sample and the horns, again, they were kind of all over the place. But so just my point is, with the sample, I've added a little bit of reverb, and with the return 1, just a tiny amount. And what that's done is, because the reverb is spread out in the stereo field, I've got control of the sample. I've taken the sample, I've given it some width with the reverb. So I've given it my own width, basically. You know, you've taken control of it. All that crazy stuff that was going on in the original sample, I've put it into mono, I've controlled it, and then I've added my own width to it. And then with the horns, I added some auto pan, so it's kind of going around in the mix nicely. So again, I've taken control of it by bouncing it to a mono file, and then I have added auto pan and some delay, which is ping-ponging a little bit, and some reverb as well, so it's giving it a lot of width. And you know, you can hear that in the mix, and you know, this is the thing. If you bounce something to mono, it gives you control over it, especially with samples. Where the stereo field was all over the place. I mean, this particular drum track, the hi-hats were in the right hand side, left hand side maybe. The snares were bouncing all over the place because they'd put some crazy plate reverb on it, and the kick drum was like hard panned to the left. So with that particular one, I had to bring it into the center because it was just nuts. And you know, and in fact, actually, I think I've added a tiny bit of reverb on the send effect to again give it a little bit of width, but still keep it front and center, because you know, you want the drums to be focused, especially in house music, in boom bap, maybe not so much with trap. You know, it depends on the genre. But this particular track, I needed focus drums front and center, and I wanted to get control over the sample again. So that's just, I mean, they're very, very basic things that I have done, all very, very subtle on the individual channels. But I didn't do any of that, to be honest, until I'd first set up the master bus. This, just to let you know, I had actually done it previously, but I wanted to go for it live with you. So, this is what you would do with a master bus if you mix top down in the way that I do. You would get your balance right. Just get the instruments all in the right place so it sounds pretty decent. And then you would look to the master bus, and that's when I've decided it needed a bit of glue, it needed a bit of EQ, it needed a bit of saturation throughout. Plonk the limiter on the end, and then I go back to the individual channels, decide what needs to be done, if in fact anything needs to be done. Because bear in mind as well, you're using samples. You might be using sample packs, you might be using samples off an old jazz record or an old funk or prog rock record or whatever. So that's been EQ'd and mastered. So you don't immediately assume that you need to add compression and that you need to add EQ. You need to assess, you need to make the decision. And then obviously, you need to assess how, when they all fit together, do they need EQ and do they need compression? Don't make these decisions in solo, because you can make a track sound amazing in solo, but then when you put it into the rest of the mix, in the context of the rest of the mix, it sounds terrible, and you can't understand why. Why does it sound? Why is the kick drum conflicting with the sample? And that's because you've done it in solo. You've got the drum sounding great. Then you've brought the sample in, but there's loads of bottoms and low mids going on in the sample as well, so they're conflicting with each other. So mix in the context of the mix. And the reason why doing the master bus early in the mix, it's not wrong or right, it's just how I do it. And the reason why I like doing it is because you can make those general decisions very, very early on. Do the drums conflict with the bass? Is there a lead guitar that's conflicting with the vocals? Is there a pad synth that's got too much low mids in it that's conflicting with the vocals? Do I need to roll off some of the highs on the drums because they're conflicting too much with some of the percussion or the lead sound or a guitar sound? And you can assess that, I feel, a lot easier if you do a lot of the processing on the master bus first. And there you have it. Now remember, the processing that you do on the master bus is going to be different for every single track that you work on. Don't look at the numbers that I've done. Don't look at the chain that I've done and think, right, this is the way that it must be done. My chain will quite often start like that. Maybe 80% of the mixes that I do will be in that order, but it won't always be the same. The numbers will be different. Use your ears, don't do anything by default. Listen to the track, assess the track before you start, make some decisions, even sit down and make notes of your rough mix. Does it need more low end? Does it need a bit of high mids? Is there too much going on in the highs? If you make those assessments before you start, then you won't get overwhelmed when you start mixing, because it can be overwhelming. You've got all these frequency ranges going on, stereo field bouncing around on your. You've got the room to take into consideration if you're using monitors. Otherwise, you're using headphones and it's going all over the place. If you make the assessments and the decisions early, before you even start really even listening to the music, before you get into the depths of it, you're not going to get overwhelmed as easily. So yeah, make those decisions early on. And remember as well, please download the template, please go ahead and use it, but do remember it's inspiration, it's a guide, it's not definitive, it's not going to make your track immediately sound good if it's in that order, if you apply it exactly to the numbers that I applied. Don't use it in that way. Use it as a starting point, use it as a guide. You might look at it and just think, this is terrible, Conan, don't like the order at all, don't like what you've done there. And that's cool as well, because to me, I've done my job, because I've inspired you to look at something and think, that's not right, I don't like it, I want to try it in a different way. So good or bad, use the template as a guide. And hopefully it will inspire you or get you in the ballpark for a radio ready mix just straight out of the MPC, or a guideline before you mix it in your DAW. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.